Thank you, Davey. So glad you could come here tonight. There is an old joke back in the days when clubs like this were open only to men. Speaking of the three main clubs in DC at the time, the Cosmos Club is for men with brains, the Metropolitan Club is for men with money, and the University Club is for men with neither. You might have seen all the photos downstairs of the Nobel Prize winners who have been members of this club, and we thought it was a wonderful place to host an event like this. We believe we'll have some great brains on display, and of course, in a classical building and room such as this. I am president of the National Civic Art Society, and thank you for joining us this evening to hear a dialogue discussion on dramatic cultural change and the future of architecture. We would like to thank Roberta and Howard Amundsen for very generously sponsoring this event. Founded in 2002, the National Civic Art Society educates and empowers our leaders in the promotion of public art and architecture worthy of our great republic. We do so by advocating for the classical tradition in civic design. We believe that that tradition is unparalleled in its dignity, beauty, and harmony, not to mention its legibility to the common man. It is no accident that the founding fathers chose the classical style when designing the nation's capital and core buildings of government. The founders sought to harken back to Republican Rome and democratic Athens, and they knew that classical architecture was time-honored and timeless. The National Civic Art Society works to continue and expand upon the founders' vision for the nation's capital and federal design, but we also concern ourselves with the future of architecture more generally. We maintain that contemporary architecture is by and large a failure. The public finds it ugly, strange, and off-putting. It has created a built environment that is degraded and dehumanizing. The reason for this failure is the ideology of architectural modernism, which came to dominance after the Second World War and represented a complete rejection of the past. The National Civic Art Society endeavors to help architecture return to its pre-modernist roots, particularly the forms, principles, and standards of the classical tradition and the humanistic architectural idioms that derived from it. To learn more about the National Civic Art Society, please visit our website, civicart.org. Now, allow me to introduce our two speakers this evening. After the two have made their presentations, a conversation will ensue, which will be followed by audience Q&A. Speaking first is Michael G. Imber. Michael is the principal architect of Michael G. Imber Architects, a modern classical firm located in San Antonio, Texas. His firm has been recognized for a body of work that is strong in historic sentiment, yet modern in its execution. Michael has been honored with numerous local and national design awards, notably being honored with the Lifetime Arthur Ross Award for his enduring commitment to the classical tradition in residential architecture, civic buildings, and neighborhood design. He was inducted into the American Institute of Architects College of Fellows for his contribution to American design, and he was also honored with the Texas Society of Architects William W. Caudill Award for his achievements as a young architect and for his contributions to the AIA. He has won 4 National Palladio Awards for outstanding achievement in traditional design, as well as numerous AIA awards and Texas Institute of Classical Architecture and Art Staub Awards. Michael is equally known for his idyllic ranch and country houses throughout Texas and the United States, and for his coastal residences and luxury resorts around the world, receiving much recognition for their sensitivity to culture, landscape, material, and craft. Michael was founding president of the ICANA Texas chapter, is a current board member of the Sir John Soanes Museum Foundation in New York, and is on the leadership board for the Design Leadership Network. In 2013, Rizzoli Press released a monograph of his work titled Michael G. Imber, Ranches, Villas, and Houses. Speaking after Michael will be Duo Dickinson, an architect based out of the New Haven, Connecticut area. A graduate of Cornell, Duo opened his architectural practice in 1987 and has built over 700 projects, including 70 pro bono efforts for the Habitat for Humanity of Greater New Haven. His work has received more than 30 awards and has been published in more than 70 publications. He is the architecture critic for the New Haven Register and is a feature writer for the Hartford Courant Media Group and Common Edge Collaborative. His blog is called Saved by Design. Duo has written 8 books. His latest, titled A House Called New England, which he co-authored with Steve Culpepper, will be released this year. Duo also hosts the radio series Homepage on WPKN Radio and is taught at Yale College and Roger Williams University. Duo sits on 7 nonprofit boards, including the New Haven Preservation Trust and the Katharine Hepburn Cultural Arts Center. 20 to 30% of his office's ongoing work is dedicated to pro bono or at-cost work for nonprofits. Please join me in welcoming Michael Imber and Duo Dickinson.
Well, thank you, Justin, and thank you to the National Civic and Art Society. I drew the long straw so I wouldn't have to follow Duo. I don't know, what else to say about modern architecture after Justin's introduction there. It's pretty accurate. So, figure out how to work this and get started here. Wasn't that one. Uh-oh. So, besides being a practicing office, and I like to say that, we're not academics, we're not teachers, we're not anything but really practicing architects in our firm. But we do find that we have a voice, in architecture and what's going on today in today's culture. And, in our blog, which we publish weekly, we often, talk about, what it means today to be human and to build and to do things with your hands. We've gotten pretty well known for these blog posts that we do, talking about these issues today about place and about authenticity and about real architecture. I think the first time I got Justin's attention was with this blog, a blog post I did a couple years ago. I think I'd opened an architectural magazine, just got really pissed off. So, I put pen to paper and started writing about, what I felt was wrong with the architectural profession today. This was also at a time that the AIA had started a new effort to publicize architects and to tell people what architects can bring to their lives. The problem was it was just the opposite of what I felt was truth in architecture. So, when I was asked to come and talk for 15 minutes about, cultural change and what's happening today with architecture, such a big subject in such a small amount of time, I went back to an experience I had just a couple of weeks ago, where Justin mentioned that I sit on the board for this design leadership network. We had our summit in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, which was this nexus of where everything is coming from in the future. It's where this energy for change is coming from. And it was an interesting week in that for 2 reasons. One, we sit there and we listen to the vice president of Instagram and Facebook and Pinterest and all these things they're doing with algorithms and how the computers are determining what we should see and what we should know and how everything is moving in the future. It was really, we all left there just scared the pants out of us. This one guy got up, this gentleman by the name of Gabe Zickerman, CEO of a company named Dopamine, who got up and talked about not only the Amazonation of America, but what he was most known for is the gamification of America. And what he's brought to Silicon Valley is this idea that everything's a game and that we can addict people to our personal devices by making everything a game. These are, this is the next game. And so they use these techniques in creating a game for everything you use to suck people in and give them that drop of dopamine to keep them, wait a second, it's telling me where I parked my car. That everything we do today is a game. And I think the ironic thing about Gabe was that he's most famous now for he's invented an app for people who are addicted to their personal devices. So anyway, he's making his way. But the other thing that I was doing while I was out there is I was asked to give a tour. I was asked to give a tour of the arts and crafts movement in America and about its formation in San Francisco, the birth of arts and crafts in San Francisco. And so, of course, all of this was brought about by this incredible cultural shift that happened first in England with the Industrial Revolution. There was a complete shift in the way we did things, the way we built things, the way we even survived, and that millions of people ended up going to factories to work. That ended up creating an entire new class of middle-class citizens, which had a new way of living. Everything completely changed in England and the world at that time. Shortly thereafter, there was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Worcester. He went by Uncle Joe to Daniel Burnham, moved out to San Francisco, and as a preacher, he wanted to build a church that really represented how architecture could help reinforce this idea that nature and beauty is what brings about morality in people. It's what nurtures mankind. And so he went to an architect, A.P. Brown, and asked A.P. if he would build this church that he wanted to collaborate on. A.P. said, well, I really can't afford to do this. Here's my draftsman, Bernard Maybeck. And they went to work on this little church that was all based on this idea of bringing nature into the city and having this meeting house where people can discuss ideas and how we can improve living for the daily lives of San Franciscans and to the common man. At the same time, we had architects like Ernest Coxhead, who was freshly arrived from England himself, bringing these ideas of the arts and crafts movement to San Francisco. He and Willis Polk had this idea that we can bring beauty, we can bring quality of life to the common man in the simplest forms and in the simple houses. And in the same moment, we can build a San Francisco that has an identity. And so they did this both in urban housing types, and they did this in suburban housing types. And what they did out of this universal idea that nature and beauty can bring a quality to our lives ended up creating the beautiful city of San Francisco that we know today. So Bernard Maybeck obviously went on to have this long, illustrious career. Here we have the Panama Exhibition building of the Palace of Fine Arts towards the end of his career, which really embodied these ideas of beauty that Bernard Maybeck had, and about art, and the idea that art was melancholy, tempered by beauty. Bernard was also a teacher. He had famous students like Julia Morgan, as well as a student by the name of Arthur Brown, who went on to design the City Hall of San Francisco, really creating this amazing civic architecture for San Francisco. Arthur Brown then, obviously understood these ideas of beauty and timelessness that we can bring to society and the virtues that beauty brings to our society. He ended up coming on to Washington, D.C. Here we see one of his buildings at the Federal Triangle, civic architecture at its best. And then we have young nephew Daniel Burnham with the Macmillan Plan in Washington, D.C. This idea of the City Beautiful movement created a moral and civic virtue among urban populations, believed that beautification can promote harmonious social order. The Macmillan Plan attempted to reinforce the unrealized aspects of L'Enfant's plan. So here we had, cities that were in strife, cities that were, lost among, what America was. This was, following the Civil War, following all this divisiveness, and this idea that our cities can help unite us. Here's Daniel Burnham's Union Station that we see up the road. So, it was from these ideas that bring us the Washington that we know today, the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial, and then brought this idea of the City Beautiful movement to other cities, and this idea of civic pride. So, beauty wasn't new to us. Beauty was always innate in who we were. It didn't matter if you were rich. It didn't matter if you were a common man. It was trans-religious, and it was trans-cultural. It was something that was deep in our DNA. One of the other things that came out of San Francisco in this new shift that we're seeing in what's happening in Silicon Valley is that before we had innovators, this culture of innovation. Now what Silicon Valley is focused on is this culture of disruptors. And we see that in architecture. In a recent article in Forbes on disruptors, it says disruptors are different than innovators. Disruptors seek to replace existing technologies, markets, and industries by making them obsolete. It is at once creative and destructive. So, we see here Corbus's plan for Paris. Corbus was one of our earliest disruptors, a plan to replace the historic fabric of Paris with something completely new and innovative. And then what we see today are those who follow. This is the Salt Lake City Federal Courthouse by Thomas Pfeiffer. And we have Zaha Hadid in Antwerp. Zaha says, for many years, I love this little quote of hers, for many years, I've hated nature. As a student, I refused to put a plant anywhere. A living plant, that is. Dead plants are okay. And then we have the Royal Ontario Museum by Daniel Lipskin. From his webpage, this is from his webpage. Daniel Lipskin is renowned for his ability to evoke cultural memory in buildings. This is Denver Museum. All these are, again, using these algorithms for design. They are intentionally jarring and intentionally disorienting. Here we have the Pace Foundation in Paris by Renzo Piano, which is known as blob architecture. And then we have the Art Museum in Graz, Australia. The team of architects used an innovative stylistic idiom known as blob architecture within the historical ambiance of Moorsstadt, the gigantic building affectionately called the Friendly Alien by the creators Colin Fourier and Peter Cook. So, we have this idea of these architects and these architects preying, on rather than what we know as beauty, but our primal fears. Here we have Rem Koolhaas. I think what we are experiencing is a global triumph of eccentricity. Lots of extravagant buildings are being built, buildings that have no meaning, have no functionality. It's rather about spectacular shape and, of course, the architect's egos. Tom Main says, I've always been interested in architecture of resistance, architecture that has some power over the way we live. Working under adversarial conditions could be seen as a plus because you are offering alternatives. Still, there are situations that make you ask the questions, do I want to be a part of this? Of course, San Franciscans really didn't like this building and complained bitterly about it. You see Arthur Brown's Civic Center in the background. So Tom Main's answer to that, this is his Caltrain headquarters in Northern California. Tom Main's answer to that is a huge problem in society is the enormous ignorance of the ideas that underlie modern art. So, in closing, I'm not saying that all modern art is bad. Not all modern art is bad for civic architecture. Last week, I was in Louis Kahn's Kimball Art Museum, and you have a building that is completely nurturing, a building that's completely filled with spirit. You see little ladies going to luncheons, and you see young school kids running about the halls. We had an hour to kill before our meeting, so here's one of our young men in our office having a conference call out on one of the porches. It was a beautiful afternoon. But what I am saying is that we've reached this fork in the road where architecture is taking us down this realm of modern art that nobody understands from a humanistic standpoint. We've reached this era of nihilism, where there is no morality and there is no meaning. This is an art installation called Bed by Tracy Ehrman. So, in ending this is this kind of famous photo of a modern art museum where somebody put their glasses in front of the wall and stood back and waited to see what happened. The Latin definition of idiot, idiota, one who is concerned only with one's self-centeredness and has no regard for the public or public life. I'd like to make sure that we don't end up following the path of idiots. Thank you.
First, thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's crazy traffic, and we're not that famous, and so thank you for coming. My talk will be, shall we say, different from the last talk of really cool images. For the last 2 years, I've written about monthly for a thing that's quite amazing called Common Edge Collaborative, written by or created by Martin Peterson and Stephen Bingler. And their desire was to get away from object-focused architectural journalism, stop talking about particular buildings, and really start talking about ideas, movements, and thoughts. So I've taken a bunch of the articles. I reread every article I did today for them, and it just proves again how bad a writer I am. But at the same time, some of the thoughts are pretty good, and some of the thoughts I think are relevant, because the topic tonight is really about the fact that architecture is, I think, on the edge. Architecture is the tip of an iceberg of a gigantic technological, cultural, aesthetic change that we can't deal with. Architecture has been called and is the mother of the arts, meaning it's not just about things or ideas or weather or gravity or materials or use or cultures. It's about everything. It's about everything. So when the force is disrupted by whatever is disrupting the force at any given time, architecture shifts. And you could make a case that what changed the master builder mode of designing and building buildings to the architect mode of designing and having others build buildings was the Industrial Revolution. It changed that technological sweep to make money and to make things better and faster, flipped the entire culture of the 19th century into the 20th century with a power and an intensity which nobody predicted at the time. And it gave birth to some of the rarefied ideologies that you saw in the last slideshow. But I think it really comes down to calling the question about what I've done for 40 years, designing buildings. Because there really are, to me, two ways to think about buildings: a red way and a blue way. There is a definite distinction in architecture between those that really think about history, gravity, and use as things to bend, deny, change, have a dialogue with. And there are more architects that really want to be relevant and have value and to solve problems. And you could make the case that that inherent distinction between approaches to building something that is different and is not seen before, and something which goes along to get along, represents the two sides of every person's character, represents the two sides of our politics, represents a lot of the dynamic that happens in our culture between either being interesting, exciting, and evocative, or safe and comfortable and funny. So those two things are seen in architecture all the time, but more now because those two things have evolved over the last 50 years into what I would call style. Modernism and traditionalism. Two ways of looking at the same thing. And I wrote today, or finished writing today, a piece up at Yale where Robert A.M. Stern has just done the new two colleges at Yale. And it was the first project there for residential work in 55 years. And it followed Morse and Stiles College by Eero Saarinen. Morse and Stiles College was one of the modernist wave of constructions that happened at Yale, and actually was wildly interesting in that it took an extremely distilled form of building and applied ancient planning ideas and experiential design to it. Stern took, just now, 55 years later, an extreme planning exercise and essentially took James Gamble Rogers' architecture and made the exact same building in traditional architecture. So if you ever go up to New Haven, they're within about 1 minute of each other. They're for the same client. They have the same budget. One is modern and one is traditional, overtly so. And I think why we have a real issue today is that what happened over the course of time, I hope I get this right, yes. What happened over the course of time was that one side of this equation subsumed to the blue parts of that map. It became the elite sense of education, of publishing, awards, recognition, architects designing for other architects, and it made for something which took the face of architecture and made it less relevant for more people. It's not really about style, it's about attitude. I was part of that. In 1973, I went to Cornell University, and they had just fired 3 professors from something called the Texas Rangers from the University of Texas. The reason they fired them was for diversity. Not because they were white males. They were all white males. We were all white males. What it was that they had come from a revolution in Texas in 1953 called the Texas Rangers that had thought about the pedagogy of architectural education and distilled it to a series of fine arts principles that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with design. That hubris, that sense that you could distill everything down into its essential elements of fine arts design, propelled these people into creating a whole new way of teaching that freaked out Kermit Parsons, the dean, who was a city planner, and Matthias Ungers, the head of the graduate school, who was an interesting person, into saying, you guys get out because you're too much like the other guys. Now, one of those guys went on to be the dean at Yale. I mean, they're all really world-class academics. They're all great teachers. And they brought in people who are different. So for a brief period in the 70s, I studied for 4.5 years. I got out a half year early. Rich, interesting, diverse, bizarre ideas about architecture, not one way or the highway. And right now, in education, the AIA, all the basic highfalutin things, and I'm a fellow in the AIA too, just like Michael, and I've won lots of AIA awards just like Michael, and I've sat on lots of AIA juries just like Michael. We've all been there, done that, and I wrote for the AIA imprint for Taunton Magazine. So I don't diss the AIA, but I'm saying that when groupthink creates the idea that to have integrity or cred, you've got to essentially take complete control of a building and distinguish it from all of the ways the past has thought about buildings, you get a certain type of architecture. And what is interesting about that is architecture has become less relevant. And combined with technology, there are fewer architects. Just like seminary in the Northeast, where religion is essentially dying. I'm on the mission council for the Episcopal Church of Connecticut, so I'm completely immersed in old line Protestant religions that are on their deathbed. What we have is something where the relevance of architecture and the relevance of religion is absolutely true. People need to have hope, people need to have buildings, and the problem is that the way the delivery system of church and the delivery system of architecture today has distanced itself away from the way the vast majority of people actually think about buildings. What architects tend to do is they tend to be posers. They want to be cool. They want to be part of the in crowd. They want to basically do what is done. They want to be able to have a knockoff. They want to be able to allude to something else. And if you are an architect or you look at architecture stuff, you'll see that in the last 5 years, the cantilever has become this gigantic gesture. You saw many of them on Mr. Imber's slideshow. But it is something that bespeaks the fact that architects really want to be on the cutting edge, but at the same time want to be safe. The two are mutually exclusive. And because of that, the coolness of the imagery, the fact that it is hip and happening, interesting, draws people to it. So in 1965, 3,000 degrees were granted every year, and in 1965 and 2015, 6,000 degrees, twice as many degrees were granted. There are roughly 200,000 people with architecture degrees in their pockets. There are approximately 60,000 of those who are licensed that are practicing. That went away. Oh, well, it's not doing it. But anyway, the bottom line is Georgetown University did a study. At the time, this is a few years ago, there were almost 14% unemployed architects who wanted to be architects that couldn't be. It's the highest of the rates. And let's think about this a different way. You think about architects, the mother of the arts. It's like a lung surgeon, or it's a president of the United States. It's a super important thing. You do these great things. So I don't think of it that way. I think of it as an athlete. I think of it as a musician. I think of it as an actor. I think of it as somebody that loves what they do so much they would do it for close to free. And we do. We are, in a way, inbred into designing things that people live in. And because of that, we are also willing to essentially follow a path of a fine artist, not necessarily an engineer, a lawyer, or a doctor. But what's happened to us is the same thing that's actually happening to many professions. The profession has changed because artificial intelligence of all types has changed the way we do it. And if that happens, more and more people don't take the architecture licensing exam. They don't actually see, why should I become licensed? This is a 10-year period. You can see the vast majority of people, almost 40,000, are in the system and are not taking the licensing exam. And there are even websites devoted to not taking the exam and not being an architect, but going through the $200,000 or $300,000 of education to not do what you were trained in. And corollary to that is a revolution. It is, remember computer-aided design? We all have computer-aided design. Well, BIM, Building Information Management, which is Revit, which is any number of other software programs, is CAD, computer-aided design, on steroids. It takes the next level of essentially how you create a building, analyzes it like the gigantic patchwork quilt of all the technologies of structure, site design, products, everything, essentially creates the most gigantic database you can imagine, then essentially uses architects to denote what they like, even stylistically, and it asks the computer to essentially design the building. Now, you still do sketches, you still do things, but it essentially removes architects out of the equation of how buildings are made. And of course, Michael has one of these, he told me. It goes into the fabrication of things with nobody touching it. My first 9 years, I worked in a shop in Connecticut. Everything was made by hand. We had 16, 17 people. I was the human Revit. I would take all the paper drawings that architects would bring in, and I would do the shop drawings, I would work them, and I was that computer software program in 1979. And I did it. Now, that same shop has 6 people working in it, and 3 machines that are worth about $5 million that are 20 times bigger than this, and they make phenomenal stuff for me and for everybody else. It is not a bad thing that technology does these things. It actually makes things more and cheaper and more precise, and it does many, many good things. But it changes the way architects do their work so that if there were 60 people working for 6 months to make a skyscraper, which was true in the 30s and 40s, there are maybe 20 people working for 3 months to build a skyscraper. That takes a huge amount out of the usable numbers of humans that are doing our work, and yet more people want to be architects than ever before. Let me go back. What it also does is it also takes a project this group is very interested in, and it puts it into a different place. BIM, 3D modeling, allows you to even have the idea that you could take McKim, Mead, and White's destroyed building and simply reanimate the dead, to take a dead architect's thing and make it a living architect's thing. Personally, I think I would like Michael Imbert to design the new Penn Station, not Mr. McKim or Mr. White or any of those other people. So I think that that is a downside, that you could actually go back to the past. But the bigger downside, and the biggest downside, and what I'll pretty much close with, I know you want to get me off the stage, is the fact that that overabundance of education, that extreme shift in technology, which is essentially making that map that you saw, the haves, the have-nots, the elites, the non-elites, the technology-dependent people, and the people that don't have any technology. That huge split that's taking our country and putting it into a place where there's more uncertainty than certitude. That shift is in architecture right now, in that there are 6,000 architects that look a lot like this, 6,000 architects that are essentially teaching about 24,000 other architects. And they're graduating them all the time. And what ends up happening is that you have articles like I just wrote, Architecture's a Lifestyle Choice, and because architects are not employed as much, you have architects talking to architects about architects. And what it boils down to is that Architizer, a place that does that, ripped me apart. On that article, I became the great Satan. And in fact, I even discovered last week where at the time, a year and a half ago, they had a podcast where essentially I was a very bad person. And what ends up happening is they were livid about my website. They thought my website was a horrible, terrible thing. And I had to respond because it was free, because I have 1.5 people out of 7 doing pro bono work. To build a new website now costs $30,000 or $40,000. To maintain a website appropriately costs another $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 a year. I take that money and I do buildings for people that need them without cost. No response. However, I do have a new website because I'm trading a website with a graphic designer for redesigning your house. So I've answered it. It's better. You can actually read things. It looks okay. But what's happened is there's a class of architects that cannot earn a living being architects. So this architect does this building. This is the Pirelli building. that was the Armstrong Rubber Building in New Haven. I was writing an article for the Hartford Courant about it. I see this thing. I go, oh, wow, it's a proposal to do this cool thing. I call the architect up, and he says, well, yeah, it's a cool project. I said, wow, who's doing it? Who'd you hire? Well, no one really hired me. Well, what are you really doing? Well, I just had an idea. I thought it'd be kind of cool. And now with the ability to actually make something that's cool and interesting, you have people sitting in their basement on their laptop, clicking, making cool and interesting things and calling themselves architects. Or you have architects in schools like SciArc making sculpture and art that they call architecture, but it's really just beautiful, wonderful art. You've also got writing. You have writing of architects to architects about architects. Now, the other thing is that I've written 8 books and done all this stuff, by the way. 1995 on Amazon, out tomorrow. And in those books, I've actually talked about 100 other architects, shown the buildings they have done, have brought architecture into people's houses, not dissing websites, but actually dealing with buildings. And amongst all of this, this is the actual diagram of where construction is. We kind of forget this. The lower inflation-adjusted numbers for all construction in the United States, you can see how low we are compared to where we were a decade ago. We are in a place where we are unsure. Unsure typically means you build less. Building less means you don't have as much architecture work. In houses, this has been true forever for architects. We do 2% of the houses because we've had artificial intelligence in house design for 100 years. It's called the 1001 plan book that you would buy from a store, and you'd say $17 to get a set of plans and build a house. Well, we also don't do any pro bono work. There's the risk involved. These are habitat houses that my office drew based on a committee design, and we built 80 of them, and we didn't charge a nickel. And they're not anything that's going to save anything, but they cost $80,000 to build, total, done. In all of this, my field, residential architecture, has been more impacted by the recession than any other field. And part of that is that when you build a house, that's a house that we did 20 years ago that was under construction on an island, you have to know how to build something, or what you're doing is really selling people pretty pictures that cost more to build and have bad things happen to them later on because the budget is out of control. In this marketplace, where people don't know how to build, there are a lot of people learning how to do things. There's a desire to be educated. Last year, SciArc creates the Center for Advanced Studies in Architecture, offering 4 graduate degrees. 3 of them have absolutely nothing to do with building buildings. One is on fiction, one is on comic book making, and the other is something else. And there's one on technology, there's one on techniques. That is a way for people that have already gotten a degree, probably in architecture, to spend another 2 or 3 years on loans not doing architecture. In this mix are 5 or 6 schools right now in America which are dedicated to split away from this consensus groupthink modernism elite. And they're at Notre Dame, and they're at Catholic University here, and they're in Denver and other places. And they have decided, you know what, we're going to focus on this, on tradition and history, and we're just not going to deal with the rest. Now that, to me, just me, is a lot like the Texas Rangers. I'd rather have classicists next to modernists next to spaceship designers. That would be my way of going. And all of those things, to me, create beauty. Beauty. That's why architects are architects. We want to make beauty. This article came out, that's a house I'm finishing up in California. That article came out, and I got a call to basically become part of a new program that Christopher Alexander started in Naples, Italy, called the Building Beauty Program. And it basically is something I want you to look at. The first day of classes was today, and it's on something called NeoMod, NeoSob in Naples. And it essentially bases a postgraduate program not on making sculptures, not on talking to architects about other architects. You actually are challenged over 3 semesters to actually make something, and make something that is beautiful. No style, using history, building in their historic courtyard, thinking about more things. Because for me, and I'll close with this, for me, the reason why I'm an Episcopalian, the reason why I like being in America, the reason why I'm here talking to you, the reason why I write books, the reason why I played football. The reason why I love having kids and love my wife is because I like bandwidth. I like doing more things, not fewer things. I like our culture looking at things like building information management and not running away or leaping into them, saying like the people here say, that could be good, but I've got to manage it. The problem right now is architects are in a defensive crouch. We really don't know what's going on. And the truth is, even with these alternatives cropping up, we are still in a very bad place. And the truth is, an article I wrote essentially equated Donald Trump being elected president as a response to entrenched, elite, non-listening majority to architecture, where a great number of architects are now feeling, hey, you guys aren't listening to me, I feel disenfranchised, I do great work for lots of people, and I never get an award, I never get a teaching position, I never get anything. And that level of discontent and that level of running away from change further marginalizes architects and makes us less meaningful and less valuable for people like you. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for both of your talks. Found them very stimulating. To start the discussion, I was wondering if you could talk about the claim that many people make that there is this feeling of insecurity and anxiety in the modern world. People change jobs more frequently than ever. They might have to move to a new place to find a job. There's explosive technological growth where you're constantly having to learn about a new phone or a new program. People may be feeling left behind. How should architecture respond to that?
Well, that's a big question. You know, I was listening to a story on NPR the other day about how teenagers today are more anxiety-ridden than ever before in the past, to the point where they can't get out of bed and go to school anymore because they don't know how to deal with real situations where they have to know the answer, or they have to respond in person, that they can't stop and look something up, or they have this comfort of their device. You know, I was, last week at that talk that Gabe gave, he was talking about how, because of gamification, now I've got to go back to my office in order to keep the millennials that are working, that I've got to, challenge them and reward, challenge them and reward, challenge them and reward. And it's like, are we rats now? So, that's, I feel like everybody has kind of retreated to a place where they don't know what's safe anymore. It's to a point to where, I can't say I'm proud to be an American. I can't say I'm proud to be a Southerner. I can't be proud to be a Christian. I can't be proud to be a man. God help me if I say I'm a Republican. It's, you're at this point to who am I? And, we've got architects that are filling that void for us, saying it's not important who you think you are. What's important is who I think you are. And they're filling that void.
I've maybe got a darker view.
Darker than that.
Because actually, I think about we have 20-year-old children. And I think about how they view life, and with the fear and the trepidation of it, I'm simply, it's above my pay grade to know whether it's natural or not natural, or long-term or short-term. But I'm 62, and I can tell you flat out, what we've gone through in the last 10 years isn't just the economic recession. It is the absolute catapulting of technology into regions of change in people's lives that are completely out of control and are thrilling and exciting, but mostly destabilizing. The fact that you don't know how you're going to build a car 5 years from now. You don't know what city you're going to live in 2 years from now. You don't know, is the job you just went $200,000 in debt for going to be what you studied 10 years from now? That level of insecurity manifests itself to me in two things: grabbing hard for what you know is right and pushing away from anything that might make you afraid. In architecture, the polarization between extreme traditionalists and drop-dead modernists has gotten far worse than it was 20 years ago. There is actually personal attacks that take buildings that people wanted and paid for and calling them worthless, destructive, and bad. And by the way, it isn't just one or the other. Modernists say that about traditionalists. That's the normal thing. Oh, they're pandering jackasses. Modernists say, and traditionalists say about modernists, well, they're thoughtless, heartless people. The truth is, we're all people. And you make buildings you like, you make buildings you don't like. As long as I'm not paying for the building I don't like, culture will tell if it's good or bad. But because of the supercharged environment right now, even something as benign as a building has become a litmus paper for our anxiety. So it's worse. I think it's worse than it was 20 years ago.
But you mentioned, there was, in your talk, you mentioned this academic elitism that is going on, and that, as a society, there are things that we are drawn to. Use the word beauty. That's rarely used. That word is rarely used by architects today.
Crazy.
But I mean, what do you see is driving that elitism, and how can we bring that to a balance?
I'm going to be critting on Wet Friday at Yale. I'm going to be talking to the kids. I'm going to be with the other architecture professors. I critted at Yale 5 times last year. These are the brightest kids imaginable, brightest teachers imaginable. And I can tell you flat out, what drives them into a place of safety is the hunker down in the bunker of a place where they have a job. When you have 6,000 people working for very little money being adjunct faculty because they don't have the work in the office to actually make buildings, it changes the paradigm and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of becoming art enthusiasts as opposed to builders. And you're absolutely right. A great architect, you probably know him too, Barry Spiegels. He was the architect that actually created the new middle school in Newtown. And they chose him because he's part artist and part architect. He called me up, or actually we were drinking together. And basically said, you and I ought to talk to other architects. So we go and talk to the other architect. Before we do that, he says, we'll have lunch, because he's just retired. We have 6 lunches. At the lunches, he says, don't show your work. They're going to come thinking it's the dog and pony show of Barry and Duo. We're going to show all these cool projects. No. All we're going to do is we're going to ask 2 questions. And if there are architects out here, I want you to answer these questions. What today made you glad you were an architect? What today made you think it wasn't so good being an architect? I will guarantee you it revolves ultimately around beauty, about the fact that I made something that I love, or I was not allowed to make something that I love. And so beauty is the forgotten denominator in architecture. Instead, it's space, interstitiality, commonality, any number of buzzwords, code words of all stylistic persuasions that separates architects from building and separates people from architects.
I think it's interesting that became the core of both of our talks without us even talking to one another.
It's true.
And it's a dirty word in architecture today.
Architects, I have to tell you, will take what you do, because even if they do stylistically buildings they agree with, they will try to find any way to essentially impugn what you do to make them feel better about themselves. And that's just true. And that's not, by the way, this isn't just architects. I've done a lot of work in the arts. Actors, painters, bassoon players. Oh, you didn't really hit that high C, really. I heard a little
The problem is
overtone.
it's institutionalized.
Exactly. And you had mentioned something I didn't bring up. Why is this happening in the institutions? And why is this? To me, this is really, I hope you take this home with you, because at 62, I don't care if it's true or not. I'm just going to make it up. But I honestly do believe this. I do believe that it is easier, say it a third time, easier to make a modernist building that you can deal with in an academic setting, because you have controlled your mind into words, into attitudes that are identical to the painting instructor, the music instructor, the things that take ephemera, things that are not hard-edged, and you do not reveal your ignorance of construction, your ignorance of history. You don't reveal your ignorance in passing judgment, mouthing crap about buildings that are just whatever they are.
You see that conveyed all the way down into the art world as well, and that art schools no longer, when was the last time an art school taught someone how to draw? That was too expensive. So what they started doing is teaching the philosophy of art, the theory of art. And so now art is about theory, and so is architecture.
Yeah. One of the things that drew me to these people in Italy was the fact that they spent 5 years creating a curriculum that essentially says the only reason to be an architect, not the best reason, the only reason to be an architect is to build beauty. And the truth of the matter is, BIM, Building Information Management, is not a bad thing. It's a thing. The electric guitar was a weird, terrible thing when it came out. Well, think of the music that electric guitar has made in the last 100 years. The truth is, the things we make should not be the things that make us. We need to take control of the things we have, and we need to pull back education and stop making education to get students to pay our salaries as professors. We need to make architecture create buildings for other people. If you get that relevance to the culture of what you do, the self-preservation basis of education fades. There's a larger purpose.
Well, and I think beyond that, I think when there's so much divisiveness in today's world, you have to go down to the core of what's important to all of us. Mm-hmm. What becomes something that feeds all of our spirits, and beauty is that one thing.
And architects tend to think of it, because not just architects, I think musicians, athletes, you tend to think of beauty in your own terms. When I wrote that piece, which actually engendered that phone call, I was dealing with a house that I'd worked on for 10 years, every aspect of it. And essentially what I kind of realized was, I liked this house was good, but I also liked it when a baby laughed. I also liked it when a kid that I know made a tackle. I also liked it when I saw a flower that I didn't see before. I also liked it when I took cold water and drank it. There are things that happen that have beauty in them, which are lost in the rare air of architectural theory. The distinction of using your brain and only using your brain, to me, is a weird form of
using algorithms.
Yeah, it's a weird form, I think, a weird form of pornography. It's a weird way of doing something for you that implies something larger, but is in fact the most selfish act you can have.
And the shallowest act.
Exactly.
Are we still in the first question?
Yeah, really.
How would you explain the phenomenon that many leading architects don't seem to wish to make the world a better place? I mean, Rem Koolhaas, someone that you mentioned, said there are two kinds of architects in the world: those who wish to improve the world and those who wish to build the way the world is. And he put himself in that latter category. Likewise, Frank Gehry said that life is dangerous, chaotic, and surprising. Buildings should reflect that.
Well, I don't understand it personally, and that's why I don't care for his architecture, is because I don't understand it. I mean, is it... I mean, isn't that why a lot of us don't like certain buildings, is because we simply don't understand it? And I think that's what Duo and I are saying today, is if buildings don't have meaning, we can't care about them. And we have this necessity to care about things, to make them important. So...
Let me disagree with you. I think every building has meaning. But buildings are not paintings. Buildings are zillions of hours, zillions of dollars, and are in people's laps every day, especially civic buildings. So the buildings that are deeply, deeply meaningful to very, very few people have a different level of judgment than a building that is loved by many, many people. And I think using style
Or
to
by
make a street.
generations.
Yeah.
It's not just this generation, but also I see the litmus test of a good building is that can it be loved by my children,
Right.
my generation,
Yeah.
as well as my mother and her mother. You know, that's a good building.
So now we'll take a few questions from the audience. There is someone with a wireless microphone. If you could raise your hand.
Comes the tough part.
Right here on the right, on my right.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Duo, you've mentioned this specifically, but you've both discussed it, the polarization between traditionalists and modernists. And I wonder, given the state of things, if there's going to be a future, a place in the future for traditional architecture at all, can the traditionalists afford to be anything other than hardliners? I mean, they're the Melians surrounded by the Athenians in this situation. One camp's a lot bigger than the other. I'm not sure the traditionalists can afford to make any concessions.
Since you could probably elaborate more, I'll take this one first. I think that is a problem today, and it's a problem because of our institutions. What we see is that architects aren't being, and Dill mentioned this, architects aren't being taught to be architects anymore. You know, I go to San Francisco at least once a month, and I drive through what I consider one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And what I see being built in San Francisco, and there's a lot that's being built there, shows me that architects don't even know what made San Francisco a beautiful city to begin with. They're not being taught that in schools today. There are very few schools that teach architects the universal principles of what we care about as people.
I got another take on it. Maybe you won't like it. We both are good friends with Jeremiah Eck, author, but really an architect in Boston. Jeremiah came up with a statement about 10 years ago. I love it when I get architectural record. I love looking at architectural record because the contrast between the first 40 pages of advertisements and the rich, complex, interesting group of buildings, and then the paper-thin, not-so-great buildings in the rest of it, make for a rich experience of visual stimulation, because the vast majority of people that hire architects, hire not wacko, crazy, elitist art architects. They hire people that do a good job. A lot of the buildings that are made by those people are unsensational, often clumsy, not wonderful buildings. Many of them are really wonderful buildings. The buildings that are awarded, that are recognized, that are published, that are essentially architects designing for architects, get the loudest noise.
But then that's what ends up driving decisions on our civic buildings.
On our civic buildings and on our very, very public buildings, you've got just what happened. Jason, we were talking about, you've been talking about the Eisenhower Memorial, the idea that you would have a decision not based on anything but some small group of people talking about something is the definition of elitism. It's the definition of we know better, shut up. And I can tell you, how many people have seen the new School of Management building in New Haven for Yale? How many have seen that? Okay, 1, 2. So that was Sir Norman Foster. Sir Norman Foster was teaching at Yale, and Rick Levin and Senior Vice President Bruce Alexander and Robert A.M. Stern and I was told this by somebody who was there, have Sir Norman Foster there, and he's showing them the drawings. And it is essentially Dulles Airport, not so good. Or maybe, the DC Performing Arts Center, not so good. Anyway, they say to him, Norm, it just isn't banging enough. Let it rip. Let's go. Those architects were talking to architects and also the president and saying, make it better for me. Meanwhile, I'm on the New Haven Preservation Trust board, and we're going, does it really have to be like that big? Really? Really that big? And we're just like, yeah, shut up. So that level is no different than, by the way, what happened 2 months ago. They tore down a whole segment of a Philip Johnson building that I didn't love, but Yale tore it down, even though it's on the National Register. They tore it down because they just didn't like it. Because it was a few people that didn't like it, and they just took it down. So I think what we're talking about in terms of what's happening in our culture is that elitism is prospering when the lack of surety of people who are not elites pull back, hunker down, and don't question and don't assert.
Another question.
Fanatical?
Well, you know, I think, to be honest, as a cradle Episcopalian, goes to church every week, not wild about communion, I can tell you it's easy to find religion when you don't know what the hell's going on. And I think what these kids have been fed in this group, and this is a new group, by the way, and I write recommendations and get kids into grad school all the time and talk to them afterward. What they have found, having been in a real gut architecture office like we have, where you build stuff, you make stuff, you don't make excuses, you build buildings, and you work hard to make that happen, is that the people that aren't in that don't have the excitement of making stuff, they have to feel that it's worth it, right? So they end up creating a tapestry of dogma, a canon, which is self-serving. It's the fervor. It's as self-serving as the blue and the red on this thing. If you listen to Fox News, everything they say, you say, right on. You listen to MSNBC, right on. They're talking to themselves about the same thing, and it's as if they're talking on two different planets. And those architects on that website saying I sucked, I go, really?
Another question. Back here, over here.
Thank you for coming today. I'm from the great suburban hell that is Dallas, so I have a lot of love for San Antonio. Now, I'm curious. I tend to agree with everything that you all are saying and have said tonight, but I think there's a certain honesty in architecture that we should apply to certain buildings. So, for example, the FBI headquarters are like, it's hideous, right? It's like brutal as hell, right? But I think that it makes a lot of sense for what that building is and does and is in our society. Do you think there's a place for horrid architecture for certain? HUD is hideous. There's a bunch of government buildings that are awful. And I guess what I always hear from my friends is, well, there's a certain honesty in architecture we should apply to those buildings. Do you agree? Do you disagree?
I agree completely. You know, I think there should be an honesty in architecture, and that's why no building that we design is ever the same. We've designed within a wide spectrum of buildings because every building should express its owner, it should express its place, it should express its use. I don't think that's a stylistic choice. I think it's something that architects should all respond to.
I mean, the truth is, the only unconditional good to me is just what Michael said. It's inclusion of design criteria. What we have now is a reductionist tendency to reduce the amount of things you think about when you do a building. And when you do that, you typically make a less good building. If you consider more things, if you don't dismiss history or dismiss innovation, you include both, it's harder. And you will make more indefendable acts. But if you can suspend your own judgment about you not being competent to do things like that, you'll make better buildings, buildings like he makes, buildings like some other people make. They're harder buildings to talk about. They're harder buildings to present in a photograph. They are more interesting buildings to be in. But our tendency in times when we're having this gigantic change is not to build beautiful housing, but to build tenements. Because you're responding to fewer criteria because the criteria is stark and deadly. So right now, the culture's in a place where it's kind of deadly. People are scared, people are defensive, people are angry. The architecture that is presented is either louder and crazier, or maybe not. And so it ends up making people feel more distanced from me, him. It makes people feel less able to affect change in buildings. I'll just do the building like I saw before, or I'll build this crazy glass box because I like glass boxes.
So I just have a quick story regarding that. I'm sure everybody here knows the Milwaukee Museum of Art by Calatrava. I was given a tour by a University of Wisconsin architecture professor of the museum not long after it was built. And what a lot of people don't know is the design for that building was actually a train station in France. And Calatrava walked into this board of elderly women that he drew a beautiful drawing of people walking down the beach with parasols and his building in the background, and they all fell in love with him. And he built his train station. It doesn't work very well as a museum, but it certainly became a symbol of Milwaukee.
Well, please join me in thanking Michael Imber and Duo Dickinson.